Everyone has to make a bit of an amendment to their listing of Game of the Year in the Big 12. Of course, Oklahoma, Texas was expected. Fill in the name Baylor. The Bears are 9-0 despite the status of their impressive or unimpressive wins. Still 9-0 is 9-0, and Oklahoma is coming to town this week. We got Jason Ray on the line from Last Word on College Football. Jason, how you doing today?
Doing good, Mark. Thanks for having me on again.
Absolutely. Need to get you on here. Oklahoma's in the thick of it, as expected. Baylor, not expected. Let's talk about the Sooners first. And, of course, what turned out to be a really exciting game wasn't for the most part against Iowa State. I got to say that I had my eye on it for much of the game. And then once we got down to the final 10 minutes, I was locked and intrigued. And it turned out to be a barn burner with Iowa State.
Yeah, it's about that game was about as confusing as the weather is around here in Oklahoma. I mean, yesterday it was about 70 degrees. Today we were in the 20s, and it's kind of icy and snowy. So when you look at that, kind of certainly compared to the game, especially in the first half, Oklahoma controlled the game for the most part. Up 35-14 at halftime. They were clicking on pretty much all cylinders offensively. Like I said, they scored 35 points at half. They got a touchdown right before the end of the first half, and you kind of thought this was a typical Oklahoma home game where they cruise early and they just kind of put it on coast into the finish line, and certainly that wasn't the case. They defensively, they kind of reverted back again to the 2018 style of defense in the last few years. I think probably really disappointing just to see, how well they played early in the year and how poorly they played over the last couple of weeks. Giving up in the 40s to Kansas State and certainly Iowa State last week, 41. So they got a lot of work to do on the defensive side of the ball. Just in terms of, just like I said, you see a lot of the same things that you saw over the last few years. You saw people out of position. You saw Kenneth Murray kind of getting caught up in a lot of the trash and, not able to fight off blocks and being out of position and some big runs. Saw a lot of the primarily tight ends running, wide open pretty much across the field there in the fourth quarter, where Iowa State scored 3 consecutive touchdowns. Just wasn't quite able to put to get the ball in the end zone on the 2-point conversion. But and then offensively, probably Jalen Hurts' worst performance of the year, and you say that he had 5 touchdowns in the first half, but particularly in the second half, Oklahoma, they had the CeeDee Lamb fumble in the fourth quarter, then they had the Jalen Hurts turnover there late in the game, which set up that could have been the game tying or the game winning drive for Iowa State. But watching that game in the first half, he made a lot of bad decisions, and it worked. He must be living right because it was working out for him. He threw he threw 2 potential pick sixes that Iowa State dropped, and then the initial touchdown to CeeDee Lamb was, really just a really bad decision. He just kind of trusted CeeDee to go up and get it, which he did. But I think one of the things that we're seeing over the last couple of games is, while the offense is still, scoring in the 40s and they're still the highest scoring offense in the country, you're seeing them go through droughts at bad times offensively. They only scored 7 points in the second half and nothing in the fourth quarter, and they went, I think, about 20 minutes of game time without scoring. And when you have a defense that is predicated on creating turnovers and they're not able to create any turnovers, and they're on the field a lot, and you're asking a lot of a defense that, quite frankly, they're still learning how to play. It's the same defense that they had last year in terms of personnel for the most part. So as teams learn how to win, I think defensively they are still learning what it takes to win. Maybe not not always just on the field in terms of practice habits and just kind of learning how to, kind of get over the hump and play the type of defense that they need to play to be a championship contender, because it's still not where it needs to be for them to be in that, that top four, that top six area, and they're just not quite there yet.
We've got Jason Ray on the line from Last Word on College Football. Oklahoma, Baylor, the game in the Big 12 this year as it stands right now, with the Sooners at 8-1. Baylor 9-0. They survived triple overtime against TCU 29-23. You mentioned CeeDee Lamb. The stat sheet doesn't do it justice. 8 catches for 167 and 2 touchdowns is mighty impressive, but you got to watch the guy play, and just the exceptional plays that he makes in the open field, both catching the football, plucking it out of the air, and then also the moves that he can make in the open field and the burst that he has. And he's just a big, strong kid as well. So the combination of size, speed, and athleticism is just remarkable, and bailed them out of a lot of situations in which, he just made a play is all there was to it, as they mounted the 42 points early in the game and then held on from there. You mentioned the defense, Jason. So I for sure understand the line of thinking that they wouldn't that they would have issues latching onto the system and so forth. But at the same time, I would think that they would have had those issues early in the season, and that they would be acclimating themselves better to the defense. Obviously, the competition's been tougher in conference than what they faced in the non-conference, but they are just they only had 3 tackles for loss. They had no sacks. They made just basically disruptive plays against an Iowa State team that we talked about. They're a really good team. They're well coached, one of the better coaches in the country, and Matt Campbell and his staff, and that it was going to be a tough game. And I actually, early in the game, I thought, my goodness, I thought Iowa State was going to play them tougher than this, and then eventually they did. And they're just a really good bunch. I enjoy watching them play just because I think they're a gritty, tough team that's just so laser focused and just won't give up. And that's what it turned out to be, despite their athletic limitations and not stretching a defense. They certainly figured it out in the second half, while Oklahoma continued to make misplays on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, it's really perplexing to watch, Mark. I mean, to your point, you would expect with a new coordinator and new assistants coming in that they would maybe struggle a little bit early, and then as the season goes on, get better. But the trend from the previous coaching regime has kind of reared its ugly head here, as they have, they played well early, and here down the stretch, they appear to be getting worse. The one thing that you look for in terms of, when you have back-to-back 40-point defensive games, that you've given up that many points and in as many games, you want to look for a little bit of a silver lining. They were still pretty decent on third downs. That's one of the areas that they were terrible in a year ago, and they're still ranked 13th in the country in terms of third down percentage giving up. And they were Iowa State only converted 4 of 12 for the game, last week. So that's, I mean, if you're looking for a bright spot, but even listening to Alex Grinch after the game, he was he looked like a guy who was extremely confused in terms of just looking and seeing what he's seeing on Saturday versus what he's seeing on the practice field. Like I said earlier, they seem to be a little bit out of position, which was primarily what we saw a lot last year. You saw receivers, West Virginia, Oklahoma State, all the way down the line in the conference, where you saw, receivers just wide open, and you really haven't seen that a whole lot this year. They're certainly undersized in the secondary, for example, but you haven't seen a whole lot of receivers just running wide open. Kind of the talent is what it is at this point, but that's the one thing that's probably pretty concerning that you saw out of Oklahoma's defense on Saturday was and I mean, it's not like it's wide receivers. I mean, it's tight ends running wide open. So certainly not sure where they go from here. Hopefully they can get they can get some of that corrected before, certainly before they play Baylor, or there may be a loss or two, down the stretch with Baylor and with Oklahoma State, TCU, right there. So I mean, and another thing, and they mentioned it on the broadcast, and John Michael Terry was one of their outside linebackers, and he's out. He got injured in the, I believe it was a Texas game, but he's out for the year, and he was really critical in kind of keeping the edge from a containment perspective. And you notice a lot of their, in terms of running the football, they're not getting gashed up the middle. They're losing containment on the edge, and teams are starting to get outside on them a little bit. So that's hurtful. And then they had quite a few injuries. I think injuries that happened there in the fourth quarter that kind of decimated their depth and kind of left them scrambling a little bit. So you take that with a grain of salt. You have 3 or 4 injuries in an already thin area of your team, and sometimes you just kind of have to hold on. So we'll see how they can recover. One defensive lineman, Kenneth Mann, Lincoln Riley indicated that he was out for the year as well. Also, Trey Sermon on the offensive side of the ball, he tore his ACL against Iowa State, so he will be out for the rest of the year as well.
If you take this matchup on the surface, you've got 2 Big 12 teams. You've got one that's undefeated. They're playing at home. They're a 9.5-point underdog. So on the surface, that doesn't seem to make sense. But you delve a little bit deeper, and even if you take the names off the two brands, of course, we would expect Oklahoma to be a substantial favorite, and they are. And if you, again, dive a little bit deeper into the metrics, there's a reason why. Oklahoma, despite having their issues against Iowa State most recently and a few other games as well, they've been more dominant for longer stretches of time against better competition. Baylor continues to win the games in the Big 12 League. They're starting to hit a stretch. Obviously, they're going to face their biggest challenge to date coming up at home on Saturday. But this TCU game has much been like what they've faced in recent weeks against Oklahoma State. West Virginia, they only beat them by 3 points at home, and we know that the Mountaineers are certainly nothing close to what they've been the last couple of years. So they just continue to win games and find ways, but don't appear to be anything really that special. But here they are at 9-0. Now, if they win this one, look out. But when you look at the offensive personnel, it appears to be it's a typical Big 12. It's not elite, but typical Big 12 team where they've got big wide receivers and Denzel Mims in particular, and Tyquan Thornton's a really good player. John Lovett and the other running back, JaMychal Hasty, form a tremendous combination. And Charlie Brewer's got a lot of starts and a lot of experience at this point under his belt. So they can hurt you, and maybe they're a team that you could either say, well, they've gotten lucky, or maybe you can say they know how to win games, and we will see it all play out in Waco.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Mark. I mean, I think they've learned how to win very quickly. When Matt Rule took over the program, it was pretty much in shambles from how Art Briles left it. The first season a couple years ago, he went 1-11, and then kind of 2 years removed from that, they're at 9-0, and yeah, to your point, Mark, they've got, I believe, four games that they've won. On the last play of the game, against Iowa State, they kicked the field goal to win that game. They scored a touchdown in double overtime against Texas Tech to win that game. They blocked a West Virginia field goal at home on Thursday night to win that one, and then certainly most recently they stopped TCU and on the fourth down play there in the goal line with. A fourth down to win that game. So, it kind of reminds me a little bit, kind of just going back a little bit of the 2001 Ohio State team. When you certainly not the same talent level, but just in terms of just being able to continuously win close games. So, and Matt Rule's really built that team in an atypical Big 12 way, right? The Big 12 way certainly is just outscoring your opponents, throwing the ball over the field, and Baylor doesn't necessarily do that. They're one of the best teams in the defensively in the Big 12. They're number 31st overall in total defense, and I think where they've been in terms of just kind of living right, call it lucky, call it making your own luck, learning how to win, kind of on the fly. But they're number 17 in the country in turnover margin, and able to get turnovers, especially when you're struggling. They were able to do that. Certainly, they were able to do that against TCU. They picked off Duke a couple of times in that game. But surprisingly, when you look at that, Charlie Brewer's a nice player. He's nothing, he's nothing that you're probably going to look at and, your jaw's going to drop and, you watch him play. I mean, he's solid. He's serviceable. You mentioned the running backs and certainly the wide receivers with Denzel Mims and Tyquan Thornton. But it'll be interesting to see what they bring. College game day will be there. There will be probably more excitement in that stadium than they had probably since Oklahoma played them. I think what it was 4 years ago, it would have been in the Baker Mayfield's last year in his Heisman year, it was the year before his Heisman year, his second year at quarterback when Oklahoma went down there. Baylor was, I believe, ranked in the top 5 under Briles, and Oklahoma went down and won that game as an underdog. So the roles are a little bit reversed just in terms of Oklahoma going on the road and a pretty substantial favorite for a top 10 matchup. But yeah, I mean, absolutely, Mark, as you mentioned, if somehow Baylor is able to win this game, they're certainly going to be in the Big 12 championship game, and then aside from that, they're probably a game, a home win against Texas. They believe they play Texas next week, and then another game, championship game, against whether it's Oklahoma or Texas again, whoever that might be, away from a potential college football playoff berth, and we, there at Last Word on College Football, we talked a little bit about this. Should a team like Alabama go the rest of the way undefeated, and should a team like Baylor go in 13-0? What does the committee look like? Would there be a chance that a Baylor going undefeated could possibly get left out of the college football playoff with a team like Alabama? I mean, I think me and you are both on the same side. And we can certainly get into that with that. I don't certainly a 13-0 Big 12, not even the Big 12, if it's a Big 10 or whatever conference, should never get left out of the playoff. But I think you and me both know, whether it's right or wrong, that probably would end up being a discussion.
Jason, it's mentioned at times there's a reason we play the games and not just try to measure the talent on the two teams. If we're going to do that every year, we'll just take the recruiting rankings and line up Ohio State, Clemson, Alabama, and Georgia, and they can play a playoff every year. But actually, there's a reason we play the games, and we've got the teams sanctioned and categorized in divisions and conferences to determine who the best team is from that particular group of teams. Otherwise, we could just list them all 1 through 130 in the FBS, and we could randomize a schedule and just give them all a schedule at the beginning of the season. We could do that as well, because I think that this Oklahoma game for Baylor, I liken it to Minnesota's game last week against Penn State. Racking up wins, not getting respect. For Minnesota, it's been a little bit different because they've been dominant in recent weeks, but they haven't played anybody that good. Baylor's actually played decent teams, better than Minnesota, but they've been squeaking by. But this is kind of the, okay, what do you have for us? We're going to throw a legitimate opponent in front of you. What do you have? And so this is Baylor's game, like a Minnesota last week. And my goodness, I'll even take that to another degree. And some people are going to think I'm crazy, but if Baylor loses a game and wins the Big 12 championship at 12-1, I believe that they should be in over. Alabama's just the classic case. Alabama at 11-1, not going to a conference championship. I think if you tack on a second loss and win your conference under these conditions, I would like to see all the conference champions. I don't care if you go 8-5 in the playoff, but under these circumstances where we have to evaluate teams and we only have 4 spots, yes, I can understand why a two-loss conference champion would be left out. But if you're going to go by the wins and losses, again, the Big 12 is a good conference with a lot of capable teams. Not great teams, but a lot of like capable, like top 30-ish kind of teams. And Baylor is navigating the wins, regardless of how impressive or not impressive they look. They are winning the games, and they're going to have to beat Oklahoma most likely twice to get this thing done and win a conference championship. Or they could lose, of course, as you mentioned, because of what they've accomplished today, could lose to Oklahoma and then win the rematch. We saw Texas or Oklahoma do that last year against Texas, and it worked out for them. So yeah, they've got a lot of work to do, but it's intriguing to see and what the committee will think of both Minnesota coming up in their next rankings and then Baylor, should they pull off the upset at home the next week, in regards to the perception of the team. So good stuff from Jason Ray on Last Word on College Football, breaking down Oklahoma Baylor. College Game Day will be there in Waco as the two get it on, and probably the first of two as it stands right now. We shall see. All right, Jason, appreciate you stopping by.
All right. Thanks for having me on, Mark.